From the Western Mass News studios in Springfield, this is Western Mass News Getting Answers with Dave Mattson.
Thanks for joining me for this week's edition of Western Mass News Getting Answers. Every week, I'm joined by political and business leaders and other newsmakers to talk about the issues that impact you. This week, I am pleased to be joined by retired Associate Justice of Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, John Greaney. A native of Westfield, Justice Greaney's legal career spans nearly 65 years. A graduate of Holy Cross and New York University Law School, Justice Greaney first started out as a lawyer at the Springfield firm of Eli & King, where he practiced for a decade until his appointment to the Hampden County Housing Court. In 1976, he joined the Massachusetts Appeals Court, where he became Chief Justice in 1984. In 1989, he was appointed to the Supreme Judicial Court, where he served until 2008. As you'll learn in this half hour, Justice Greaney is far from being retired. We will focus on his career on the bench, some of the groundbreaking decisions he was involved in, and the current state of the U.S. Supreme Court. Justice Greaney, I cannot tell you how thrilled I am to have you here.
Well, I'm happy to be here, and I'm glad you invited me.
Well, you know, the thing is we've had you on many times, but never to sit down in a long form like this.
Okay.
I'm really glad to do this. Let's start with a look back on your long career. I understand that you became an attorney with the goal of one day becoming a judge.
I did. During summers, I worked at the probation office in the Westfield District Court. And I had a lot of time to sit in the courtroom and watch the Judge Garvey, deal with the cases. And I was really enthralled with the way he handled them. He combined justice and mercy in a way that I thought was very, very favorable, particularly to defendants. So I began to focus on being a judge. The second thing that happened was I majored in classics at Holy Cross, Latin and Greek. And then when I got to my senior year, I said, what am I going to do with this? I'm not going to teach Latin and Greek in the original text. I'm not going to go into seminary. So my option was law school, and I was fortunate to get a scholarship, and I went. And it went on from there. Now, you first made your mark in the 70s as the presiding judge in the Hampden County Housing Court. Only the second in the state. You referred to it as the true people's court. Yes, because the courts, which you've probably seen, Superior Court, appellate courts, are very formal by and large. And this was a court where, based on the Boston experience of the first housing court, people were going to come in there and represent themselves. And of course, we have a large Latino and Puerto Rican population in this area. And a large racial population. So I wanted to make sure they got a fair shake in court. So I designed the court forms to be simplified. I had them translated on the back into Spanish, which really wasn't being done at the time. I gave everybody a chance to be heard. And on small claims day, for example, we'd hear 20 or more cases, and I made sure everybody got a written decision, of at least a paragraph explaining why I ruled the way I did. So, and then we took it on the road. Yeah, that was unique at the time, right? Yeah, that was very unique. And I said, well, people want to see the court, and they can't come to Springfield necessarily, particularly in the hill towns. And so what can we do about that? So I had the staff call city halls and other places where they had like makeshift rooms and benches. And we went there. And that model is actually being followed by the appeals court now, which rotates around the state every once in a while to show what they do. Bringing the system to the people. Correct. More than anything else. Because it's one of those things, I suppose you don't want the first time you're in a courtroom to be, well, when you're charged with something. Yeah. To be able to see the process, because it is fascinating. There were a lot of civil cases, a lot of evictions, small claims for rent and things like that. The other thing we did that was somewhat unique, in addition to what I've talked about already, is I set up a citizens advisory council of citizens from each of the cities and towns and areas that the court served. And I brought them in once a month for a meeting to see how we were doing. And I said, now look, you're not going to tell me how to decide cases, but you can tell me how we're doing and are we doing the right thing, and maybe we should redesign our forms and How can we reach out more and explain things? And they were great,
Also,
frankly.
to see, too, at the time that you had the leeway and the flexibility, because, again, I think we said that it was only the second housing court in the state. So
It was. And the Boston court was an urban court, and we had urban, suburban, and rural, so we had to do a little redesign to accommodate the folks out here.
But the system gave you the flexibility to be able to try different things that really, at that point in
yes.
time, were unheard of.
Yes, yes.
After the housing court, Governor Dukakis appoints you to the state superior court, then to the appeals court, where you became chief justice. Let's talk
Correct.
about that.
But
Let's talk about that.
Sure.
Your experience there. Was there an adjustment going from housing court to the appeals court for you?
well, the Superior Court buffered that
It did,
because
yeah.
the Superior Court's a trial court, a little more formal. But we had juries in the housing court, we had juries in the Superior Court for much more serious cases, murder cases and those kinds of cases. We had to write a lot of decisions in the Superior Court in what we call the equity session. So I was really fully prepared, and I liked writing, legal writing, probably because of my education, where we had to write a lot. So when I got to the appeals court, it sort of flowed along.
You were a student of law. I mean, you love
I guess you could say that.
Yeah, but always growing with it, and
Yeah.
you know, as you go from court to court too.
Yeah, my second major was the law.
Was the law
in a practical sense.
Now, I think more than anything else, who do you think had the biggest influence? I have an idea who you might say. The biggest influence on you as you worked your way through law school and onto the housing court, the appeals court, and then the state Supreme Court.
Okay, what's your idea?
The judge that you first clerked for.
Yes, well, first of all, my father,
Your father, yeah.
who was an immigrant from Ireland during the Civil War and had a very, very difficult job as a laborer. And he pushed me to get an education. Secondly, the nuns at St. Mary's, who sort of took me by the ear, and one of them told me in 7th grade, when I couldn't answer a question in class, you're never going to amount to anything. And that sort of woke me up. So I buckled down, and that got me the scholarship to Holy Cross, because we had no money to send me anywhere. And then at Holy Cross, I did reasonably well with the Jesuits, and they were a big influence on me. Particularly one in my Greek class. We were reading Plato in the original Greek, and there's a line that says, "Nosti se auton." I don't want to get too formal here, but it means know yourself. And the professor said, think about that. And I thought about it, and it later dawned on me, you've got to know your limitations and your ambitions. Like, I could never be a doctor. I can't stand the sight of blood, or a lot of other things. But the law was my nosti se auton, and I followed that. Yeah.
And you always wanted to.
And Judge Garvey.
And Judge Garvey, yes. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, Judge Greaney and I look at many of his landmark decisions that he was part of through the years. Stay with us. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. My guest this week, retired Associate Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, John Greaney. Judge Greaney, let's take a look back at some of the groundbreaking decisions that you were part of while on the state Supreme Court. I want to begin with the Goodridge versus the Department of Public Health. You wrote the concurrence to the opinion establishing Massachusetts as the first state to legalize same-sex marriage. Groundbreaking.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a big case, and we knew it was coming. And we prepared for it. We had maybe 70 briefs filed by various groups who, in addition to the parties, wanted to put in their position on it. It came down to, I realized, and I think my fellow judges realized, all of them, even though some of them dissented, that gays, same-sex people had been discriminated against throughout history, were still being discriminated against. And 4 of us decided really that the Massachusetts Constitution allowed us to take that step, because it was amended to say there'll be no discrimination in Massachusetts because of race, sex, or sexual orientation. And to me, those were very key words. So Justice Marshall wrote the majority opinion, and I won't get too technical about it, but it was a very good decision. And she basically said the current state of the law is not really a rational state considering the evolution of society. But then I said, well, I think there's a different basis to solve this, and that was the clause that I talked about, because it looked to me like pure discrimination based on sexual orientation. So I used that to argue that equal protection merited the approval of same-sex marriages.
Now, as we look at this, that really was landmark as far as how other states in the country passed that legislation.
When we did it, we thought we'd be the only one, but Vermont had done something ahead of us, but they only got as far as civil unions. The legislature came back to us in a process whereby they can ask us if we could change to something else under this. They can do it under the state constitution. And they said, is civil unions good enough? And we wrote a second decision saying, no, that's not good enough. But then it began to pick up steam in the New England states. And I said, well, yeah, they're basically forward-looking states. And then it kept moving. And then all of a sudden down south, where I thought it would never occur, Mississippi and some other places, their courts did it. And then eventually the United States Supreme Court, which likes to see things percolate in the states first, did it 15 years later.
Get the gauge. Ended in 1993, the decision to recognize the rights of gay couples in Massachusetts to adopt children.
Yes, that was 10 years before. And it was two prominent doctors who wanted to adopt a child. And the child was the biological child of one of them who had been artificially inseminated by a distant relative. And it was assigned to me, and I looked at it, and I looked at the adoption law, and it said a person can adopt another person, with the exception of fathers can't adopt sons, and sons can't adopt fathers, and mothers, daughters, etc. And I said, well, there's nothing in here that talks about the gender of any of these people or their sexual orientation. So I was able to do that without even touching, say, the constitutional issue of could they do it, and say the law permitted it. And by the way, the department, as it was called then, the Department of Social Services, was elated because for years they were placing foster children with gay couples. And they said the track record with them as parents was just absolutely wonderful. So it worked out.
It just, more as you look at it, it's common sense.
It's common sense, and now it's accepted.
Is what it comes
But it wasn't
down to.
common sense back then.
You know, you look at it, that really wasn't all that long ago.
No.
I mean, when you think about it, and
No.
then we see what's happening in the country now. It's like we took 10 steps forward. Now it seems like we're taking 10 steps back.
We are. We're taking in parts of the country, not here, fortunately, we're taking steps back that we shouldn't be doing, in my opinion.
Let's talk about, it was 1997 decision upholding a $2 million libel verdict against the Boston Herald. I remember when this came out. This was big.
Yes, it was big. That case, the judge was handling a case, a criminal case, against a 14-year-old girl who had been raped. And he purportedly said in his chambers, with the lawyers present, she should get some counseling and no, he purportedly said she'll get over it, she's only 14. So when the lawyers came out and told the reporter, he said she'll get over it. Well, then all heck broke loose. The judge is insensitive, he doesn't belong on the bench, et cetera, and so on. Well, it turned out what he had said was what I said previously. If we can get her some good counseling, she will get over it. So he hired a lawyer and he sued the Herald. And the reporter who had written that he had said the other thing had thrown away his notes, which was a very bad thing to do. I think the jury took umbrage on that. And they believed the judge. And they awarded a libel verdict that went to the our Supreme Court and was upheld.
Was upheld.
I upheld it, yeah.
In 1984, I loved reading about this. As Chief Justice of the State Court of Appeals, you made national headlines. Sports Illustrated.
Sports Illustrated.
In the power struggle over control of the Boston Red Sox. I mean, it was what, Buddy LaRue and Hayward Sullivan, right?
Yeah. Buddy LaRue and his group, who were limited partners in the general partnership with Gene Yawkey and Hayward Sullivan, staged a coup to take over the Red Sox. And of course, you can't do that as a limited partner. Your rights are very limited. So the general partners, Yawkey and so on, sued, and it came up to us, and the judge in the Superior Court had just laid LaRue out in lavender in a 60-page decision. And there really was nothing there. He had no rights. So every law firm in Boston was in the courthouse that day watching the case. They were all lined up all over the place. And the judge sitting next to me, M.I. Cutter, when it was over, it was very tense because millions and millions of dollars were involved.
Sure.
Said, say something to calm people down. So I said to the lawyer, I have one more question. And he said, what is it, Your Honor? And I said, can they do something about the pitching? Well, that calmed everything down, and it made the paper, of course. And then a couple of weeks later, I'm looking at Sports Illustrated, and there's a little caricature of a judge, and it said, that judge knows how to fix the Red Sox.
And he did. 2 years later, what happened, right? They're in the World Series.
They're in the World Series.
That really has been a trademark throughout your whole judicial career, is your sense of humor.
Well, you try to be. It's, people in courts are very tense, very worried, and they're, in most cases, they're big stakes. If you go from your apartment, maybe losing that, all the way up to the Red Sox, these are big stakes. Or socially progressive problems like same-sex marriage and adoption. So you want to calm them, and if you can say something that treats them fairly and decently and maybe get a laugh, then you've done your job.
Breaking the tension.
Right.
Was there any one case that had a profound impact on you?
Yes, there was. There was a young girl. She was 14. She was being abused by her mother and, I think, stepfather in West Springfield. And her aunt in Westfield and her husband took her in, and they abused her even further. Broken bones, bruises, multiple trips to the emergency room, and things like that. So they brought the case with us, and to remove her from their custody, and I was just horrified by it, and we did. But what really emotionally upset me was her last stay at Bay State. She was determined to be brain dead, and they came back to me and said, we want to terminate life support, which was costing at the time probably $20,000 a day, keep her alive. So based on the doctor's opinion, I said, you can do that. But before the judgment issues, there's a 30-day gap. And on about the 28th day, and she's still on the machines, the clerk came in and said, the hospital just called, she woke up. And I said, oh my God, send out the order rescinding the termination order, termination of life order. Now, she wasn't good, and I understand she's in a home somewhere in the eastern part of the state being cared for by charitable nuns. But I said, gee, that came so close, even with the doctors saying what they said, you just never know.
Sometimes miracles happen with that type of thing.
Yeah, sometimes medical miracles happen.
They do.
Yeah.
All right. Judge Greaney, we're going to have to take another break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the current state of the U.S. Supreme Court. Welcome back to Western Mass News Getting Answers. I'm pleased to be joined this week by retired Associate Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, John Greaney. You know, one of the things that stunned me the most about your career is that you were forced to retire from the bench at the age of 70. And I'm looking at it, it makes no sense to me, seeing that we have Supreme Court justices, senators, congressmen and women, and a president who are all in their late 70s or early 80s.
Yeah.
But that was what it was.
That's what it was. Remember, that's 50 plus years ago. And two problems occurred. First, that a lot of judges were staying on the bench well beyond age 70, into their 80s and 90s, and they were losing their faculties. They were falling asleep in court. They would hear cases, and they would not make a decision for years, if ever. And the second thing was, back in those days, 70 was considered old. Average lifespan might have been 73, 74. So the papers and the television did various exposés about what was happening with these old judges, and it caught fire, and they started an initiative petition to amend the Massachusetts Constitution, which said you serve for life or good behavior, to make it mandatory to retire at 70.
That's 70.
And they did. But it had a saving feature that was passed later by the legislature. You could be recalled, and that was very valuable for the court system. If you were in good health and were able to do the job properly, they could bring you back for 6 months and then another 6 months and so on. And that was a godsend for the trial courts. Now, I couldn't be recalled because there's only 7 on the Supreme Judicial Court, and you can't recall somebody and make it 8.
Yeah.
There'll be 4-4 decisions all over the place. So that didn't happen.
Let's talk about the current state of the U.S. Supreme Court. What's your opinion on that?
Oh, frankly, very, very bad. The new additions, to me, are out of touch with the American people and the progress we've made in the last 50 years. This latest decision by Judge Alito is just, to me, just a shocking example of that. And now they say, Clarence Thomas wrote the concurring opinion that it may reach out to same-sex marriage and to other rights that really have been considered cemented. Fortunately, in Massachusetts, doing away with Roe versus Wade doesn't affect us, because 2 or 3 years ago, our legislature, at the initiative of Planned Parenthood, passed something called the Roe Act that protects women for the first trimester or the first period of their pregnancy, time limits of their pregnancy to get a lawful abortion. So we're protected here, but the rest of the country, particularly in some of the states in the South, are in shambles.
When did it get so political?
Well, it's always been political, even on the state level.
The Clarence Thomas years, possibly, where it really got political?
Scalia before.
Scalia before him.
And then Thomas. Scalia was able to pull it off because he had this sense of humor and he was so bright. Thomas is a plotter and really a real surprise because he went to Holy Cross. He was educated for free at Holy Cross. But it started going off the rails with him, and then with President Trump, it really went off the rails.
All right. Judge Greaney, we are out of time. Will you come back?
Sure.
I would love to have you back. There's so much more to talk about.
Okay.
My thanks to Judge Greaney for being my guest this week, and to you at home for watching. I'm Dave Mattson. Stay safe, stay well, and join us next week for Western Mass News Getting Answers.